This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast, where my guest is green roof guru, urban designer, photographer, birdwatcher, punk ideologist, and all-round straight talker, Dusty Gedge. We talk about green infrastructure, encouraging species back into landscapes, how to maintain landscapes for habitat value, and what's being and can be done to up the green value of public spaces.
So basically, I'll do it, in a nutshell, is I originally moved up to Southeast London to join a theatre circus in Bedford. So I used to be a circus performer and an actor. But I'd always been a birdwatcher all my life, from even since I was a little, I was like one and I fell out of a baby chair chasing a robin, so my mother tells me, and I was never the same since. And about 24 years ago, 26 years ago, I set up this circus workshop for young people on a council estate, mainly because there's quite a few of them not going to school, and part of the idea of the circus workshop was to get them back to school. And one of the guys who funded that told me that they wanted this local bird watcher to pay them to do a bird survey, and I found this bird called the black redstart, and we had this idea that we'd shove things up on the roof for the black redstart as mitigation for habitat loss. And that got me into talking about, first of all, brown roofs and then green roofs. And so I went from being a sort of circus performer, actor, bird watcher, to, until a month ago, the president of the European Federation of Green Roof and Wall Associations, a kind of an important person.
Definitely you are. What is the difference between a brown roof and a green roof?
Well, now, there was about 5 of us who came up with this idea, and we knew nothing about anything, really. And the brown roof was this idea that if you in London, and many cities, there's a lot of brownfield sites, post-industrial landscapes, but they're often, at the time, 26 years ago, the ecologists started to find that these sites were really, really good for rare invertebrates, bugs and stuff like that. And I know you've had Richard Jones on. I worked with him at the time on that. And so we had this idea, if you put crushed brick and concrete up on a roof and it wasn't green, it was just kind of brown, and you let the vegetation come, that would sort of replicate a post-industrial landscape. Well, it was a bloody stupid idea, to be quite frank. It was a really stupid idea. So at the time, they only had these sort of basic sedum systems on the market in the United Kingdom. But I went off in 2000 to Switzerland to meet a researcher who's researching biodiversity. And I learned that actually what you need to do is you get if you put up a really good commercial extensive green roof substrate, which is generally actually full of a lot of crushed brick, but it's blended to support wildflowers, and you must seed or plant it. And now in our codes, it's called a biodiverse green roof. But I go to meetings sometimes, and I was the person who probably promoted the brown roof the most. And I go to meetings sometimes, people say, "Oh, well, obviously, Mr. Gedge, you don't understand what a brown roof is." And I kind of roll my eyes. And I go, "I do know what a brown roof is," because I kind of came up with the term with colleagues. And what happens with a brown roof, if it's not seeded, it becomes a buddleia forest, which is not good for the roof, to be honest, because it can affect waterproofing. So the idea now is, about 5-6 years after we came up with the brown roof idea, is you put up a commercial substrate. It's mounded, from 80 millimeters to 150 millimeters. You put in the wildflowers, seeds and wildflower plugs, and you put some sedums in there. And key from an ecological point of view, on the top of the mounds, you get taller vegetation like agrimony and, stuff, muskmallow. And down in the shallower areas, you get the kind of sedums and the low growing. And that makes it better for spider species. And in terms of invertebrate landscapes, open mosaic habitat, that's what you can measure an invertebrate habitat in terms of the number of different spider species you have, because the barer areas will be the ambush spiders, the taller vegetation areas will be the web spiders. So the principle of the brown roof, the biodiverse green roof, is to make it really good for invertebrates. And that was all researched in a PhD way back in early noughties that I set up. No, I didn't do the PhD. I'm not a doctor.
So, I mean, obviously you mentioned buddleia and presumably other things kind of drift onto these roofs. Are they difficult to maintain or to keep in that kind of state of open mosaic habitat?
No, they're not. It's the key thing about buddleia, which is there's two plants which are a problem. On most of the time, I'm in London, so but these two plants are the same all over the United Kingdom, unless you get sort of north of Manchester. So buddleia doesn't like competition. So if you get a lot of competition in, i.e., a lot of wildflower seeds and wildflower plugs and sedums, some buddleia will come on, but generally you have an autumn maintenance and you pull it out. And after about 3 or 4 years, you won't get any buddleia because it doesn't like competition. The other one, which is not actually a problem to the roof, is Canadian fleabane, which is this thing that came over in the boats, and it just doesn't look very nice. And if you don't seed and seed and plant, it is an aerial colonizer, and it will just take over roofs. It takes over sedum roofs if they're not good ones, and it just doesn't look very nice. And buddleia, to be quite frank, I can't stand the stuff. And I see landscape architects put it into landscape at ground level, and it's just, when it's in flower, it looks pretty. When it's not in flower, it's really ugly. So I'm with Bug Life, the invertebrate charity. Ban it.
Buddleia.
I do upset people when I say that, actually.
I'm not kind of any sort of advocate for buddleia, but I've got a patch of land that we work on at the charity where I work, and I have to say the buddleia, and I know it's a cliche, it is covered in butterflies and bees. They are loving it. So I kind of think maybe there is a place for it here and there, but not to become any sort of dominant species, definitely. And I guess you have to be mindful of anything out competing all the rest of things in a limited space like a roof.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, not to try and dwell on this buddleia issue, the thing is, it's Buddleia davidi, which is the problem species. There are other buddleias, and there's lilac. And, planting Buddleia davidi is just a really dumb idea. But there's several other buddleias which you can buy commercially. It's just people always buy davidi, and it's just a nightmare, We should move on to buddleia, I suspect.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's fine. And we will move on from it, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you is a very big question, and I'm good at throwing those into the mix, so apologies. But, why, in your opinion, is biodiversity in such decline? And as you say, you're predominantly in London, so I'm thinking of that from an urban perspective.
Well, I mean, biodiversity loss is biodiversity loss. I mean, and I'm not trying to avoid that because, it's intensive agriculture and, use of chemicals and pesticides, land use, and that's been going on all my life. And I'm just to promote these. I'm making all these videos for YouTube, and one of the birds that has been a success in my work, and I was brought up in the countryside, on the coast actually, and the countryside, but I've lived here for 40 years. Is in my lifetime, I've got a book which says the linnet was common before 1960. In my lifetime, it's completely collapsed in the wider countryside. And there was always a lot of linnets on brownfield sites in London. And I go on roofs now, and they're covered in linnets in London. And that really, I find very, very moving, that the work that I've been involved with has actually maintained, if not increased, the population of linnets in central London. And, it's kind of an extension of your question. What I really believe in, and I know you've had my mate John Little on here, I really believe that what we should be doing is creating living landscapes for the future. And in cities, we can do that, but we can also do that outside in the countryside. And a lot of our focus is on our cultural landscapes and cultural landscape loss. And with climate change, even last year in the heat wave, Blackheath, which I don't spend all my time on roofs, Blackheath is a big heath in southeast London. I live 20 metres away from it. I'm on it every morning, doing videos about the wildflowers on there. And there was a massive heat wave last year, and having yellow grass for 3 months, it's going to be a problem. Wildfires and all sorts of stuff. So we're going to have to adapt what our landscape looks like for the future. And if we adapt it well, we should increase it for biodiversity. But a lot of what we associate wildlife with is what is kind of a British English cultural landscape. Well, I'm not really interested in the cultural landscape. I'm interested in actually the biodiversity, what actually lives in places. I hope that answers the question, sort of.
It does, and actually it raises another one that I was going to come to later on, so I'll park that for now. But thinking about the linnet, and again, I'm making an assumption here, but if linnet populations decreased, one might assume that another species would thrive and kind of fill that ecological niche, and that bird may be less fussy. So it could, for example, be pigeons. Is that a problem, in your opinion?
No, but I do, if I was putting on my ornithologist hat, is the thing about the linnet, it likes it's really, really weedy. And what we've taken out of the landscape is weediness. And it's not being replaced by another bird. It's just that was its ecological niche, and that niche is sort of declined. I mean, don't get me wrong, you'll find linnets on heathlands, and you're down in the south coast, Sussex way, aren't you? You'll find them up at Eastbourne on Beachy Head. But in the wider countryside, the farm countryside, weediness has been extracted. Therefore, there's no linnets. And just on the linnet very quickly, because mainly I do roos and that, the linnet population is not in serious decline anymore because when was it? It was the middle of the 80s or the 90s. We started planting a lot of oilseed rape, and oilseed rape helped stabilize the population. So it's kind of interesting because it likes oilseed rape seeds.
Again, that does bring up another question, which is another big question. So apologies again. But if you think about bird diets, and there is at the moment a lack of, well, there's a decline of invertebrates, and many birds rely on those for feeding, particularly young. I can't believe more is not being done to highlight, because everybody loves birds. I would say kind of almost universally, people appreciate birds and they're big and they're noticeable. And I can't believe more's not being done to highlight this invertebrate loss and its impact on bird populations. There's this idea that maybe we can supplement the diets with fat balls and various other things that we can buy in supermarkets. Why is that issue not more widely known about?
Well, I don't, we can do that in terms of what the public can do, but really at a huge landscape level is we've got to change our land use patterns, which, to be fair, there's stuff coming out of government biodiversity net gain, nature recovery strategies, which are going to try and address that. But, we've got 40 years of this, and just, it's amusing. But, when I was a kid, driving around the Worcestershire countryside, the windscreen used to get covered in gnats. You drive around the Worcestershire countryside now, it wouldn't be covered in gnats. And the RSPB and a few of the other wildlife organisations have done some citizen science about how many insects are on your windscreen. And, you think it's quite sad that actually it was very annoying in the 1960s and 70s to have gnats all over your windscreen, but now you don't. And it says something about how we treated the countryside.
Yeah, and again, that is anecdotal, but I think a lot of people could actually see that firsthand evidence on their windscreens. But I was going to say as well, thinking about invertebrate loss, and you spoke then about biodiversity net gain, and I may be wrong, but kind of paraphrasing people that I've spoken to, is it correct to say that you could maybe get rid of something that has got biodiversity if you said what you were replacing it with was going to have more biodiversity in the long run? Is that biodiversity net gain?
Well, it's sort of, you're right. I mean, you talk to some of the heavy ecologists, because I'm city-based, I'm not so rural-based. If you're doing a housing estate in the middle of the countryside, you're going to have to destroy habitat. But what you've got to do is replace that with 10% net gain. So, is it net gain? And I can't really say any more of that. For me, in terms of what I do, if you build on a site in the City of London, it's going to be relatively easy to get net gain because you put a green roof up, and if it's done properly, that will be net gain, and it'll probably be more than 10% net gain. So for me, it works in cities. I'm not over convinced in the countryside.
I guess it's really difficult to measure as well. I presume there's a level of subjectivity in terms of measuring biodiversity and net gain, and you can tell I'm not a fan of it.
I was at a big net gain conference, asked to be a chair of a session. And I think one of the things with this is it's until it starts, we're not going to understand it. And I suspect in 5 or 6 years' time, it'll be adapted, it'll be improved, and it will get into the right direction. But it's just so early days at the moment that it's difficult to say the impact it's going to have in the first 2 years. But I think it will change. So I'm quite optimistic, but there's a long journey to go.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's a good way to look at it. And thinking about that and other initiatives, are there any other initiatives that you're particularly excited by? Again, maybe more in an urban context.
Well, I can only really talk about some of the stuff that I would like to do, and it's a sort of associated with net gain, but I'm talking to a major player in the grocery world. And, a lot of these big industrial, shopping malls and what have all this boring grass and amenity landscape. And if they turn that into landscape which has real value to biodiversity, and they would be in peri-urban and urban areas, they could maybe have biodiversity net gain credits. People would probably enjoy the landscape better. And we could actually deliver some biodiversity in our peri-urban areas at ground level. The other thing I'd like to, use this as a way to get onto, because the other thing that I do all summer every year, and I started doing it actually 20 years ago, is I collect seeds from all over Kent, Sussex, Surrey, and Southeast London, from obscure places, from national nature reserves where I've got permission, and I throw them up on roofs because it's really difficult to get the full catalogue of wildflower seeds commercially because, there's only a limited amount. And I throw them on green roofs and they grow. And my ultimate idea is, we can get some of these roofs established with maybe 148 species of obscure wildflowers that you could never buy. And then we could use that to seed ground level and to seed roof level. And sadly, I just do it on my own with my hand in a bag. But one day I wouldn't mind getting that sort of done on a more, I wouldn't like to call it industrial scale, but in a more, get a social enterprise to maybe able to take that forward, because, we're throwing in a lot of commercial seeds. And there was an interesting article last year, if I may, on this. Norfolk Wildlife Trust have found a lot of original roadside verges that are pre-World War II, which have really good wildflowers on them. And they say that the ones that are not commercial, i.e. have been around for a long time, they flower for a longer period, where the commercial ones might only flower for a week because they've been sort of industrially grown. So I think this is interesting about collecting and reusing, natural native seeds is a really interesting thing that I think we should be doing more of, not just me.
You said, obviously, with the gardeners and the feeding of birds is only done at a garden level, and you're one man going around collecting seeds and chucking them on roofs. But actually, I do think there's a power to individuals and what they can do. So if someone was listening and they just wanted to do something small scale, and it will eventually make an impact, is there anything else apart from chucking seeds up on roofs? Is there anything else you can think that people could do that would be a good thing?
Well, I mean, kind of what I do on roofs can be done at ground level. And I've really got to defer to John Little, who's, I know, has been on your show. He's my real, he's a great mate of mine. Doing some of the John Little Brownfield gardens in your own garden, and maybe even on, local authority land. And that actually connects to the wildfires and the drying of the landscape and climate change, because you're unlikely to get a wildflower fire on some of those brownfield gardens because there's little grass in them. So it's actually quite a smart thing. And John and I have chatted about this. And I think if you can do that and collect seeds locally and throw those seeds on, as well as commercial, then I think what you're doing is you're building up the, what they call the conditioning of the seeds, for the future. Because apparently if you collect seeds that have been grown on concrete, they've conditioned themselves to the harshness. Where if you're getting seeds from, a high nutrient field in Norfolk, they're not really conditioned to the, the extremities, the stresses of like a John's Brownfield garden. And just adding on that, I mean, every time I go to John's, and we met in John's a few weeks ago, is I get up in the morning and I steal all his seeds and take them home and throw them on roofs. I love stealing. I call it spreading the love. And if I may, I might send you afterwards. I've got 3 or 4 videos about spreading the love and collecting the love and then spreading the love, which, listeners might be interested in, because it's a bit of a passion of mine doing this collecting seeds business. But I think we can all do things, even making some nice thannet sand mounds in your garden so solitary bees can nest on them. Because I collect seeds and I look at the wildflowers on Blackheath, but I also do a lot of videos of all the mining wasps and solitary bees on Blackheath that nest in the paths that people have made, and bare earth is a good thing. It's a good thing.
I was thinking about importing products into a garden, and this does go for the garden scale and presumably also the wider landscapes if you're doing it in a public landscape. But if you start with a site that could be disturbed, it could be fairly original, I mean, whatever that means in this country now. But if you then import something like sand or building byproducts, are you then almost contaminating the soil?
Well, I mean, my view is if it delivers good biodiversity and it's appropriate, I mean, you wouldn't go and put a bunch of sand and rubble on a really good chalk grassland. That would just be dumb. But if you've got, a bit of black heath that's just off the heath and it's just kind of, grass and it's a bit ruderal, well, if you can motivate that up, cover it with some rubble and some sand, then, if you're making a landscape that's really good for biodiversity, that complements the biodiversity on Blackheath, let's say, but is actually part of the public thoroughfare, I don't think you're contaminating anything. I think you're just improving it. And I brought that up because my street, right at the end towards Blackheath, my neighbour, there was a bramble patch up there. She decided she didn't like it. It's not her land. It's Lord Dartmouth's land, and he doesn't care about it. She took my advice and we dug it all up. We didn't import stuff, but we stripped it all back, and she just threw a load of wildflower seeds on there. And there's an important point. The first wildflower seed she put in there was actually this bee and butterfly mix she got from somebody. Well, it was full of, North American exotics. Now, I'm not a native fascist, but on a public highway or public thoroughfare, if you're putting things like Californian poppies in and stuff like that, and people can walk those onto Blackheath, which is, a site of open metropolitan land of importance for nature, then that's not a good thing. Put it in your garden, but not on the public, importing non-native species, because it's just not a good thing. I mean, it's controversial with some people because a lot of people use these Nigel Dunnett mixes, but if they're out on the street where they can blow to places and people can walk them around, I just don't think that's actually a good thing.
I am in agreement with you, actually. And one of the things I always think, and it is again sort of projecting off into the future, but there have been times when we've had a lot of insects and they become a problem and people get upset with them. And I think the natural conclusion of all this biodiversity, and particularly invertebrate, if we manage to slow the decline, reverse it, get these species booming again, are we then going to find ourselves in a position where we get explosions of populations of certain things? And are people actually going to get bugged by the bugs?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of our native invertebrates, I've had people come up and say, oh, there's too many ants, there's too many this. And there was once over at Canary Wharf, some problems with black fly. And, they blame the green roof. Well, the black fly was because somebody had left an algae-infested crate and let it dry out. So it's generally, people then get all sort of dramatic that, these bugs are going to kill us. And you kind of go like it's a reaction rather than a response. So I just think a lot of that stuff is possibly driven by, media fear. The things we have to worry about are things like, the big wasp that, is now coming all the way up. Coming all the way up. Sorry, something came in then. So there's this big hornet which has now colonized Europe and is a threat to, it might come over here. I think we should be worried about things like that, but that's climate change. And also that hornet has come in on horticultural products from India, but we're also getting a few species that are naturally colonizing the UK. And, I found the first orchard mason bee in the United Kingdom in Blackheath in 2014, and now it's moving up to northern Germany now, and it's now all over southeast England. I think it's even got up to Manchester, and it's a really interesting bee, and it's called the orchard mason bee because it's really important for pollinating, cherry blossoms in the spring. So it's a good thing. Do you know what I mean? And there's a thing called the bee wolf, which has been around for 20 years. That has slowly been advancing north up Europe, and the bee wolf is one of the ones I film a lot on Blackheath. So I think we tend to get a bit over panicked about these things because people don't like spiders or they don't like insects, and they think insects are going to take over. Well, they're not, if ecology is in balance,
Well, yeah, and I think that's key, isn't it? And funnily enough, I did see a bee wolf in John's garden when we were there, and I did feel, yeah, it's an amazing thing.
Yeah, part of one of his sand mounds, So
It was.
so put a sand mound in, and they come. And if you like honeybees, don't put a sand mound in because they live off honeybees, which is why I like bee wolves.
Yeah, I'm a big fan too. So thinking about the garden scale again and kind of more on an individual level, obviously a lot of the people are listening, they are landscape and horticultural professionals, but there are also a lot of people who garden for biodiversity in their own patches. Have you got any kind of tips or advice that you'd like to pass on to people that they could do more of?
Well, I'm not really a gardener, so I've got all these people on Instagram saying, like, as a gardener, and I go, well, I'm not a gardener. Um, I'm sure most of your listeners are putting lots of different size sepal plants in, which is the pollinators. You've got long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees, and getting a variety of sepal stuff is good. I think going down the Mediterranean garden route is really good, using the stuff that John Little, does at ground level. And of course, I just say to everybody, get a good green roof on your shed or your extension, because that can be really wild and messy, and you can keep your garden a bit tidier. But if you're going to put a good green roof up, don't put a stupid simple sedum bloody roof up, and I need to highlight it. John and I wrote this guide which tells you exactly how to build a decent green roof. People just go out and buy a thin sedum blanket, and then 3 years later they go, "Why is it dead?" And I just makes me. I find it quite upsetting, really. If you're going to do something, just do it well. So I think the kind of gardening and landscape world is kind of moving towards delivering more complex biodiversity. But I think it's not just about the plants; it's about the substrates, and that's where John comes in, really. So I have to defer to him because I don't really do a lot at ground level.
Actually, you mentioned the sedum roofs. Apart from the fact that they may be difficult to maintain, are they any good for biodiversity?
Well, they are for the basic, generalists. But if you're not putting wildflowers in, they're just a poorer version. Linnets don't feed on sedum roofs, and the linnet is important to me. And you won't get any long-tongued bees on a sedum roof because they've got short sepals. It's just. I'm sorry, it's just I have a green roof. And it's ticking a box. It's not actually really doing something really thoughtful. Now, I always put a lot of sedums on my roofs with the wildflowers. So it's not just about having, 14 species of sedum, which is not a monoculture, but it is a monoculture. It's saying, look, let's get diversity. And that means you just got to the roofs are going to be a little bit heavier, but actually you're going to be happier in a drought wave, in a heat wave, because actually it's going to, give you more joy. And when you look at it in May, it's going to give you more joy.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So don't just tick the box, do it properly,
Yeah, put the effort into it.
Yeah, and think it through before just going, I can just buy that and shove it up, And I get a lot of, and I know John does, I get a lot of gardeners, especially since I've been on Instagram actually locally, always asking my advice about building green roofs. And there's 3 being built around my neighbourhood where I've just popped around to neighbours and said, look, here's the guide, buy it for your builder, tell him to do it. And the builders actually come up to me and they go like, that's really great. And I go like, we don't advertise it enough, John and I. So, but I think people are getting there,
I'm sure they are. And I think there's a little bit of fear involved in a green roof because people think that it needs to be really engineered and expensive, and it probably doesn't need to be, but it does need to be done right.
Yeah. And just think, I know you're in the middle of nowhere, but, I'm from East Kent and, I know the Sussex coast, if you're down on the Sussex coast or you're on the Kent coast, make a green roof that's made of cockle shells or something like that, which, then you can get this kind of vegetated shingle habitat. You go out to Dungeness and, Pevensey, it's just vegetated shingle. It's beautiful habitat. And it's perfect for green roofs. I've got a couple of videos where I go to cockleshell beaches and vegetated shingle and just say, this is a green roof. It's covered in sedums, it's covered in wildflowers that you find on green roofs, but it's vegetated shingle because it's stressed, it's wind blown, it's sun beaten, and it's not got a lot of nutrients on it. And it's perfect place to go and look at how a green roof should be.
Thank you to Dusty, and thank you to you for listening as well. I've put loads of links to Dusty's work in the show notes, so go and check those out to find out more. This week's shout out for good people doing good work goes to Fertile Fibre, who've been supplying peat-free, organic, sustainable, and even vegan if you want it, compost products for years. Their products are good, they walk the walk, and they're fully accountable for where their ingredients come from. Links to their products are in the notes as usual. Dr. Ian Bedford is here now, talking about bugs that are occasionally persecuted for no reason whatsoever, as they're super industrious, armoured cleaners.
Sometimes mistakenly called insects, woodlice are actually terrestrial crustaceans, and are therefore related to lobsters, crabs and shrimps. There's over 30 different species of woodlice in the UK that we often refer to as pillbugs, sowbugs or slaters, and they're all easily recognisable by their shiny grey plated shells and 7 pairs of legs. The females will also have a pouch on their undersides, within which they carry and protect their eggs and young. When disturbed, some woodlice species roll themselves into a ball, like miniature armadillos, whilst others will just remain motionless. Woodlice are very common within our gardens, where they remain active for up to 3 years, feeding on dead and decaying plant material. Ecologically, they're an extremely important part of nature's food webs and an essential component of the nutrient recycling process. Despite the availability of products for killing woodlice, they rarely eat living plant material, so gardeners shouldn't have to consider them as plant pests. In fact, when they are found within the structure of a living plant, they're usually just sheltering or feeding on bits of decaying or dead leaf and stem tissue. However, large colonies of woodlice can often be found under logs and pots, where they might be considered a nuisance. So if they have to be removed, it's probably best just to sweep them up with an old dustpan and brush, then relocate them under a hedge, or better still, on the compost heap.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.